Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board, and if you're new to the show and you're wondering what Living the Wildlife's all about, well, we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest control. So if you're looking for something unusual, perhaps something to help your business in the long run, technical information that you're not able to just simply Google an answer for, this is the podcast for you. So we get geeky in this particular podcast, so if you like technical information, this is the place. Glad to have you on board, of course, and do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and if you are interested in a non-YouTube based format, you can go to Rumble and just look up Wildlife Control Consultant to get my podcast there. Questions, comments, thoughts, you can always reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. You can also see some of the products that we sell. We also sell services, consulting, helping people with photographs, ghostwriting, working with their PowerPoints, that sort of thing, even protocols. Happy to do that sort of thing. Just reach out and see what our conversation can reveal. Well, I'm continuing my work in the area of bears because I have a presentation I need to do for our local search and rescue group. I volunteered to do that, so I've been kind of getting into the bear world. For those of you that have been following the podcast, you're like, I don't do bears. Yes, I understand that the vast majority of wildlife control operators aren't going to be doing bears. But nevertheless, there's information in there that may help you protect yourself and those that you love when you're working in bear country. And because bears are certainly moving into expanding their range back to their historic levels because of conservation and that sort of thing. And so it's important that you're bear aware, as they say. And to be careful out there and understanding what the research actually says. And you don't want to have paranoia, of course, but you don't want to have a false sense of security, because if you've been following with me on these three, this is my third podcast on bears, you'll notice that there's a lot we actually don't know. And this is going to be something you're going to have to keep in the back of your mind. So we have principles, you may hear guidance from various wildlife agencies. Just understand that there's no guarantee that following those rules is going to keep you alive. It's going to improve your odds. It's sort of like safe driving improves your odds, but you can't account for what someone else is going to do on the road, right? It can only take you so far. And so we need to understand what the limits of our knowledge is. And hopefully over time, that will improve so that we can have a better understanding of how to protect ourselves in these situations, because it's not going to go away, and it's probably going to get worse in terms of human attacks before it gets better. Okay, so this week I found an article. Let me pull my PowerPoint up here and get that started. I hope you all can see that. And you can see with the bears, we're going to be talking this week about firearms, because one of the things that that you may have even thought in your own head is that, well, I'll just carry a gun, right? So this was some interesting data that came out of Alaska, and so let me give you the title of the article here. Efficacy of Firearms for Bear Deterrence in Alaska. That was published in the Journal of Wildlife Management volume 76, issue 5, pages 1021 through 1027 in 2012. So let me read that again for you. It's Efficacy of Firearms for Bear Deterrence in Alaska, Journal of Wildlife Management, volume 76, issue 5, pages 1021 to 1027. And the primary author, the first author, is Tom S. Smith, and he was out of Brigham Young University. So multiple authors here, and of course this is a very important topic. Now you may say to yourself, well, I don't live in Alaska. Yes, but understand Alaska has been dealing with bear conflicts a whole lot longer than those of us here in the lower 48, right? So it is indicative, and it can provide some insights about the benefits and hazards of using firearms as a way to defend yourself against bears. Now, this is not going to be strictly about black bears, okay? So why don't we get that right off the bat here? So this particular study looked at all bear encounters. And of course, Alaska has basically 3 different kinds of bears: black bear, grizzly bear, polar bear, right? So they got all the information that they could gather on these particular incidents. And so basically, like before, you have situations where they categorize what an incident is, because they're trying to create a rubric to help understand bear behavior. What could be some triggers for bear behavior that we need to be cognizant of, right? And so this is what researchers are trying to do. We're trying to make sense of all the data that's coming in. So the incident categories that they came up with were surprise, that is, people surprised the bear; curiosity, that the bear was interested in what the humans were involved with; provoked, that is, the photographer kind of got too close into the personal space of that particular bear; predator, this is where the bear sees humans as prey; and then lastly, carcass defense, that is, the encounter with the bear occurred when the bear was trying to protect a carcass that it took over. Okay, so surprise, curiosity, provoked, predator, and carcass. Those seem to be pretty reasonable categories for what would constitute bear encounters, right, for these incidents. Now, they defined a charge, charge, a charge, as a sudden rush or a lunge to a perceived threat. So if a bear was moving toward us suddenly, then that would be considered a charge. And then they asked what was the distance to bears, like when these incidents took place, and that was less than 10 meters, 10 to 25 meters, greater than 51 meters. Okay. And they classified gun use as a successful use if the unwanted bear behavior stopped. So it didn't require the bear to be killed, right? It didn't even require that the bear be injured. It just, if the bear stopped the unwanted behavior and the gun was associated with that, then that would be a successful use of the firearm. Again, makes perfect sense. Very reasonable statement there. So here are the statistics. Okay, so they researched all the bear encounters that they could find between the years of 1883 all the way to 2009. So it's a massive amount of material. Now, obviously, it's harder to get material in the early years than it would be, of course, when things went digital, right? So there's going to be a later bias toward that. They basically found that there were 444 people involved in 269 bear incidents. And here's the breakdown on the species of bears. Brown bear, you may know that as, of course, a grizzly bear. 218 of the incidents, of those 269 incidents, were grizzlies. Very aggressive species, to be sure. Black bears were only involved in 30 of those incidents. Polar bears were involved in 6, and they couldn't figure out what the bear was in 15 of the incidents. Now, the number of bears involved: 300 brown bears, another name for grizzly. Black bears were 36, polar bears were 6, and again, the unknown bears were 15. So even though it's a massive amount of time, you would think there'd be a lot more than 444. Again, they can only comment on what someone reported, right? There were probably a lot more bear encounters out there between 1883 and 2009, and the person just didn't report it. Alaska is a massive place, okay? So they just probably weren't reported, but they could only comment on what was reported. So that's just one of the limitations of this sort of research. Now, what they found, out of the 269 incidents, 151 of them involved human injuries, right? So a little more than half were involved in injuries. So firearm success with these particular events. Handguns were used successfully in 31 of 37 encounters, right? Because a handgun wasn't involved in every issue. So pretty good. Long guns, however, were successful in 134 of 176 encounters. Okay. Now, the gun success against aggressive bear that's a sample size of 229 versus those without guns was 40. So people had conflicts with bears 40 times without guns and 229 times with guns in their data set. Now, what's interesting here is they said that there was no difference in the outcome of a human. So whether the human had a gun or whether a human didn't have a gun, it didn't really impact. In other words, statistically, they were basically the same. Okay, and there's different ways to evaluate whether there's a significant difference between two sets of data. Okay, and they said basically no difference, which is rather interesting. So that should give us a clue right off the bat that we shouldn't just simply say a gun makes me safe. Not necessarily. So they investigated, why did guns fail to help those people where it didn't work, right? So just to go back to remind you, so we have a fair number of successes with guns, right? But that portion of those people that had a gun and it wasn't successful in turning back the unwanted bear behavior, what were the reasons for that, right? And so here's the reasons that they were able to discover. 27% of the people lacked time to respond. So they had a gun, but they couldn't get it out in time, right? Got a quick draw, right? So people clearly didn't practice enough, or the encounter occurred so quickly and perhaps with such a short amount of space, they didn't have sufficient time to pull the gun. 21% who had guns didn't even use the gun. So even though they had it, they didn't reach for it. 14% had mechanical issues, like the gun jamming or something. That should be a warning sign right there, right? So make sure your gun works. 9% said it was too close to deploy. 9% missed the bear. So remember, you get an adrenaline dump. It's hard to hold a gun steady, right? It's easy to say, oh, I just shoot him. You know, when the adrenaline's moving and you're not prepared for that, and you're not trained for that, it's going to be hard, right? 8% of the time, they emptied the gun and didn't reload for whatever reason, okay? 8%, the safety of the gun was on. You know, I've been hunting, done that. About ready to zero in on a deer, pull the trigger, forgot the safety was on. Okay? And that's in a far less stressful situation than having, you know, an 800-pound bear or a 1,000-pound bear running at me. Okay? 3% of the time, the person tripped. So you're backing up, you fall over. Can't get to your gun. And 1% of the time, the bear charged the person when the person discharged the firearm. So this is in a situation where sometimes shooting a gun isn't going to help you. It's actually going to make the bear angry and actually come towards you. Now, 1% is not very much, right? But if you're the 1%, kind of sucks for you. Now, which bears were involved with these incidents? 81% of the time it was a brown bear grizzly. No shock there. Grizzlies are incredibly aggressive, right? They are a violent animal. Female bears with young were the second most common cohort involved with firearms, right? So grizzlies, watch out for. Female with cubs, watch out for, right? Those are the big two. Now, why didn't people shoot when they had the opportunity to shoot? Well, some people didn't pull the trigger because they feared hurting the person being attacked. In other words, they weren't directly being attacked, but their friend was, and they were afraid to shoot the bear because they were afraid they're going to harm their friend. Some people feared killing the bear because the bears were a protected species. Some didn't want to pack the bear out if they killed it because Alaska law required if you killed the bear, you have to skin it and pack it out, right? You can't just leave it. So you can see how there's even emotional and psychological and legal issues that weigh on a person, preventing them from even using the firearm when they have the opportunity to use the firearm. So just the mere possession of a gun, I don't want you to think that this is somehow a magical tool for you, that it's just going to magically keep animals away. No, that's not how it works. You're going to have to practice with it. You're going to have to be comfortable with it. And you're going to have to know how to use it under duress. That is when you have that adrenaline dump. The researchers did not see any difference in the type of gun, whether one brand of gun, one type of gun worked better than another on the bear and solve that. So they had no data on that type of information. And interestingly, what they found was that pepper spray worked 90% of the time with all three species. So you can see how even situations where people had a gun and the gun didn't solve the problem, pepper spray they found did work 90% of the time when it was used. So food for thought. I don't think this is a slam dunk against guns per se. However, it does tell you that guns are not the full-on answer. Perhaps this is a situation where if you're going to use a gun, however, I would encourage you, make sure you know how to use it. Make sure it's in a place accessible to you and that you've trained under stress, right? So that the time to be stressed is not when the bear is coming at you. The time to be stressed is to get that muscle motor memory done before the crisis event, right? This is why police officers practice. This is why law enforcement agents practice under these types of conditions, so that when they get that adrenaline dump in a dangerous situation, they don't have to think about it. They just act, okay? So that's what you're going to have to do. And that also goes even for bear spray, right? You need to have it in an accessible place. You need to be sure how to take the safety off. You need to know how to use it properly. Because it has some of the same issues that a gun would have. But you may not have the psychological, legal issues involved because using the spray is not going to kill the bear, right? So you don't have to worry about packing it out or something like that. And so things to think about when you're in bear country, and guns are not the panacea that you may have thought that they were. Well, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife podcast as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. We've been talking about firearms and bears, what what role they play in keeping people safe from research out of Alaska. Hope you found that interesting, because I think it has applications probably for other species as well if you're out in animal country. And remember, as we continue to expand our footprint in the world and also have greater conservation areas, human conflicts with some of these mega carnivores are going to certainly increase, and they have been increasing. So these are some serious questions and issues that we need to think about. And so don't just simply assume that all is well when you're out there, that you may be in a situation where you're in more danger than you thought you were. So keep your wits about you, those of you that live out in bear country per se. Well, thanks for listening. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife Podcast, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest control. Hope you enjoyed the show. We have a whole lot of material, of course, on YouTube through the Pest Geek Podcast, and of course with my site over on Rumble under Wildlife Control Consultant. Definitely check those things out if you're looking for more information. If you have questions, thoughts, perhaps you have a suggestion for a show, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. And yes, even if you have criticisms, would appreciate hearing those as well, because we want to try to provide factual-based information so that you can be the best wildlife control operator you can be, and also to be a well-rounded one, understanding some technical information that is not always easily available out there to the general public. So again, this is Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.